Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And again, today we're joined by Dr. Scott Bowdridge of West Virginia University. And I guess we're going to continue our discussion here on parasite resistance and how that all occurs in these sheep.
Yeah, so that last episode discussed the nuts and bolts on that immune system and really what's going on. Hopefully we can gain an appreciation for what's happening behind the scenes, the stuff that we can't see, uh, but we appreciate the benefits of having sheep that don't get heavily infected. As we move forward and kind of some of the new stuff you're looking at or the stuff you found more recently with that fecal A count EBV and having more value than just a metric for parasite resistance. And I don't feel bad bringing this up. You've presented on this data. We brought up that conversation coming out of EAPK, gave a really good talk there. And then some of the colostrum stuff that we've seen at some extension events here the last couple of years. So really, if you want to start at the high low divergently mated or randomly mated, I guess, in that first year, and looking at the death loss stuff, do you mind sharing some of that data?
No, so this this project started in 2015. It is actually Joan Burke and I at a Southern Section of Animal Science meeting. We're sitting down in between sessions and trying to figure out what to do next for the next kind of big organic grant. And I think we're in San Antonio or Fort Worth or somewhere in Texas, and we were on the phone with Ron Lewis in the airport trying to figure out how we get this grant together. And we submitted it, didn't get funded the first year, and then we tried it again and got it going and finally got it funded in 2016. So that was kind of that large, if you're involved in that large Katahdin grant where we were trying to get a lot of phenotypes on animals to get submitted for calculating the genetic breeding values or the genomically enhanced breeding values. So my part on that grant was to kind of understand immune mechanism that was occurring in the Katahdin sheep. And the way that we were going to approach this is to do a divergent mating strategy. So I sat down with Dr. Greiner and at Virginia Tech, and then the farm manager at Glade Spring, Virginia, in the Southwest Ag Experiment Station there. And we kind of convinced him begrudgingly to take just the ewe population that they had out there, split them in half, and take the low ewe, or take randomly bred ewes, and then we'll put them on high rams or rams with high, numerically high breeding values for fecal A count EBV, and then take the other group and breed them to the low rams. And we promised Lee that we would only do this once. And then it just kind of exploded from there. So the first year that this happened, we had death loss in the hybrid lambs or the high sired lambs, close to about 30%. And that was pre-weaning. So that was going from about 7 days of age to about 2 weeks post-weaning. And we were getting extraordinarily high death loss in those lambs. And Lee predicted this. He said this is going to happen. But then we started looking at the data, and it wasn't parasites that were killing those lambs. It was other diseases. It was coccidia, well, not parasites, right? So it wasn't just helminth or worm parasites. It was other things: foot rot, pneumonia, Clostridium, a variety of different things. And then Lee started working with his vet in that area, just trying to manage this death loss, and come to find out they had a high level of Clostridium type A or a Clostridium type A outbreak in kind of that part of Virginia that year. So while the low sired lambs only had a 10% death loss, the high sired lambs had a 20% increase in their death loss. So almost 30% of those lambs died. And that was really interesting. Andrew just kind of put all those data together while he was a graduate student with me. And I got really excited, but I was trying to temper my enthusiasm for that because it was just one time. We didn't know much about it. So, when I get in those situations, we go back to Dr. Notter at Virginia Tech and see if he approves, right? So we always kind of look for the approval of those senior faculty that are around to see whether or not these ideas are worth pursuing. And you get about as much excitement out of him as anything, just a or that's pretty good. Boy, that's pretty exciting. So if you can get that out of them, that's awfully good. So that's what we did. And then we did that breeding one more time, still kind of randomating those ewes to low and high sires. And while we didn't get, so the next year, Lee was vaccinating those lambs for Clostridium type A. We didn't get as dynamic of a death loss in the high sired lambs, but the low sired lambs didn't really change much. They dropped down to about 7%. The high sired lambs were about 14%. So there was still almost twice the amount of death loss that we saw in those lambs. It just wasn't as great a magnitude as we saw in the previous year. So we sat down with Lee again and proposed a new idea. And that was to take the low ewes and breed them to low sires and the high ewes to high sires. And I think his comment at the time was, do you want all the lambs to die? So he was really nervous about that. So that was about 2017. And then we started evaluating kind of the divergently mated lambs from then on. Every year since then, Lee has completely agreed to continuing that divergent mating despite any kind of problems that he sees with the lambs, because it has become an experimental model for us to evaluate both from an immunological standpoint here at WVU. Once Andrew started at NC State, he's using some of those sheep for his research projects. And then Virginia Tech has their projects going on too. So you got 3 institutions using the same farm that was set up to have this divergent mating system. So then what's happened every year after that is that we still get the low sired animals or the low bred animals at this point now having a markedly lower death loss to weaning that is not parasite derived. It's not, at least it's not worm parasite derived. There are other sources of their death loss going to weaning. So that's kind of where we're at right now. One of my students that came in, so Andrew found all of this data and started that. I had another student that came in from North Carolina. She just spoke at the expo meeting here a couple weeks ago and kind of shared her data. So what she did for her master's project was to evaluate, and our thought was that we've got these sheep that are selected for parasite resistance, but they're not dying from parasites. They're dying, well, not the selected ones, but the ones that are selected to be susceptible were dying from other diseases. So our thought was, or our hypothesis was, that sheep that were selected to be more parasite resistant might have just a better immune response to everything. So we began to start diving into those data. And Lee was gracious enough to give Andrew a lot of his production records. And we found that ewes that had negative fecal A count breeding values were less likely to be culled due to mastitis. Ewes with positive fecal A count breeding values were about 10% more likely to be culled due to mastitis. So we had a 12% cull rate on that group. We had a 2% cull rate on the low group, just based off mastitis. So that kind of drove our thought that there's generalized immunity that is coming from sheep that are selected to be more resistant to parasites within the same breed. So an easy way to look at this is just look at antibody response to vaccination. We know what's going to happen with that. All those sheep are going to get vaccinated regardless. So it was a really simple project to put forward. I had a student that went out there, and this was right in the middle of COVID. So she was having to drive from here down to Glade Spring, Virginia, which is about a 4.5-hour drive, bleed all of these lambs, get all that blood together, get back in the car, drive all the way up, back up here, process blood samples, and evaluate antibody production to a CD&T vaccination. So a very common clostridial vaccine that's given to sheep across the country. What we found was that the sheep that had lower breeding values, so they themselves, when we looked at their breeding values, they generated more antibody in response to the vaccine. So in some way, having antibody in circulation in response to the vaccine, because lambs are going to be boosted before weaning, that would prevent any kind of, I always think about when you're creep feeding lambs, or when you're even supplementing lambs, you always find that one lamb in that group that's just the superstar, that's the rock star. And then about 2 weeks before weaning, you walk out there and they're laying there dead. And what happened with those lambs? More often than not, it's a clostridial disease that are killing those lambs just from overeating. Did those lambs have enough protection against that particular pathogen? And what we were finding out is the low bred sheep had higher antibody level, which would indicate that they responded better to that vaccine.
So just to clarify, the low bred sheep are those with the best parasite resistant numbers, the negative
That's
numbers.
correct. So they would be the negative,
Okay.
ones
And
with
then,
negative values for fecal A count breeding value.
and then, of course, then the hybrid are the very little parasite resistant.
That's correct. So they would
Okay.
be strong positive. So basically, our cutoff for the ewes, when we were mating them, is if they were below breed average, and breed average is changing every year, right? So if
Right.
they're below breed average, then they got put into the low bred group, or the sheep with negative breeding values. If they were above breed average, they got mated to rams that had it. So the breeding values on these rams were extraordinarily different, right? So I think one ram, this is before genomic enhanced EBVs, he was like, we called him devil ram. He was plus 666, right, for fecal A count breeding value, with an 85-90% accuracy value on that breeding value. Then we're using rams on the other side of that were all negative 99 to negative 75, with high accuracies on those traits, and Katahdin and index scores that were right around breed average. So they couldn't be below breed average. They needed to be above breed average.
So the vaccine portion of it was really your first look after finding that the death loss differences, at trying to identify a justification for this generalized immunity, or improved generalized immunity. Following that, do you mind talking about the LPS trial and really why LPS works as a tool for evaluating that generalized immunity and kind of the behavior associated with that?
Yeah, so Cam was there when we were doing all of this stuff. So if you're going to try to evaluate generalized immunity, you need to give the animals another pathogen to test that. Unfortunately, us or Virginia Tech or many of these state institutions don't have the facilities to treat animals with a known pathogen, and that changes the regulatory standards by which experiments can be conducted. But what I can do is I can mimic a bacterial infection, or at least the response to a bacterial infection, by giving animals a product that is found on gram-negative bacteria. So like E. coli has a component on its cell wall called lipopolysaccharide. So it's a lipid and all of these different sugar groups put together, and that's lipopolysaccharide. Lipopolysaccharide, we have receptors for it. Sheep have receptors for it, and it is a unique component. I think in the last time I talked about those unique components that are found on pathogens, and your body can recognize those instantly. We're born with those receptors. We already are. That's just preformed as a part of our natural being, is that we have receptors for lipopolysaccharide. So
Receptors for, what do the receptors do, just briefly?
So those receptors are going to bind LPS and then initiate a cascade of immune events that is going to result in fever. It's going to result in increased heart rate, labored breathing, mucosal responses. So you'll get a snotty nose. It'll cause some diarrhea in some animals. It's going to elevate all sorts of things that are going on in your liver. So that response is basically a complete and systemic inflammatory response. So
And the
animals
nice
are not going
thing,
to feel very well after they get this.
the nice thing with LPS is, as you mentioned, it fits into that animal welfare kind of checklist. You're able to do this without the facilities or the red tape that's associated with those
With the
more
biological
aggressive
organism. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. So anyway, you give them this LPS, and then what would you hypothesize and what actually happened?
So what we're thinking about with this is that if we have Katahdins that are low bred, meaning that they have a negative fecal A count EBV, they should have a better immune response or be able to respond to the LPS and then clear the response and not have a sustained level of sickness after they're given LPS. So, and that's come from some experiments that we did with the St. Croix. So when we give the St. Croix LPS, they spike a fever in about 2.5 hours after giving it to them. And then that fever's gone by 6 hours. So those sheep look really ill around 2 hours. Then 6 hours later, they're fine.
And I think we should also mention, when we're talking about generalized immunity, LPS is not mimicking a parasite infection, and that immune system really has two routes of, to simplify it, has two routes of determining pathogen in that self non-self situation.
Correct. And it has more than two routes. It has multiple
Right.
different routes depending on the pathogen that is exposed to here. So the immune response that is elicited by LPS is completely different than the immune response that we see to a helminth or a worm parasite infection. It's really more akin to a response that you would get to a bacterial infection. So you get fever, you get lethargy, you get inflammation, all of those kind of things that you see, that you can visibly see in the animals. When we see sick animals, you know, they always see that sheep's ears are a window to their soul and what's going on with them. Their ears are going to drop down, their head's going to drop, they're going to start behaving a lot differently. So when we do this with Suffolk sheep, for example, their fever is sustained for a long period of time, for about 10 hours. And it really doesn't come down until about the 11th or 12th hour after they've been given LPS. And we've had some sheep actually get so much cytokine in activity, so immune hormone activity, that they die from just the LPS treatment. So I think most of us have heard about cytokine storms with COVID and some of the responses to the vaccine that was given, and people having massive cytokine responses to that. The same thing happened in some of those sheep where their liver just shuts down altogether. So our hypothesis was that the St. Croix sheep were a major contributor to the pedigree of, or to the production of Katahdin sheep, and what Michael Peel used in the 50s and 60s while he was in Maine making Katahdin sheep was using the St. Croix as kind of a basis for that breed. So as those animals become more parasite resistant, they should have a little bit more St. Croix heritage in them. At least that was the thought. So we set up this experiment where we had St. Croix sheep, we had low bred Katahdin animals. So they had an average fecal A count breeding value of, I think it was about -88. Then we had a high group that had an average fecal A count breeding value of +288. And then we had a group of Suffolk sheep that we had in there. So we had these 4 groups. There were 40 sheep there together total. And then what we did was we gave everybody LPS intravenously, and then monitor temperature and behavior for the next 12 hours hourly. So we had groups of people out there taking blood from all of these animals, getting temperatures, getting rectal temperatures on these sheep. And what happens, you know, kind of the moral of the story here is that the St. Croix and the Suffolk are the most different from each other. But what our hypothesis was that the low-bred Katahdins were going to behave more like the St. Croix, and the high-bred Katahdins were going to behave more like the Suffolk sheep. And that's pretty much what we found. So the St. Croix sheep start to feel better around hour 6. The low-bred Katahdins started behaving normally around hour 7. The hybrid or the Suffolks didn't start feeling better until about hour 10. The hybrid Katahdins were right there on top of them right around the same time at hour 10. So we're getting these behavior differences that are occurring in their response. The high-bred Katahdins and the Suffolks had a sustained fever, where the low-bred Katahdins and the St. Croix did not. So how sick an animal is and the length of time an animal is sick is going to drive decision-making about whether or not that animal receives treatment. So some of these St. Croix sheep may get sick and then a few hours later feel better, then they're not going to receive an antibiotic treatment. Whereas some of these sheep that hang around for a longer period of time are more likely to receive that. I think that we're all pretty aware of how our ability to treat those things are going to be reduced based off of some of the new FDA rules about drug availability. So,
Yeah, and I will attest, what you
go
mentioned
ahead.
in behavior and looking at those ears and uh, just how those animals act is, I think, more telling than what the physical data was. Temperature, those items. When you actually look at the video footage on, Suffolk sheep versus at 6 hours versus the St. Croix, and those St. Croix are actually up and eating, and those Suffolks are still laying down, droopy eared. It's just absolutely fascinating. And so kind of providing the validation for, again, a secondary or a generalized immunity, something that is indicating improved immunity outside of what we'd expect in our parasite model, using a different part of that immune system. What's the value then moving into the colostrum data on kind of antibodies that are present? We know the value of colostrum. I think we've talked about that here on the podcast early on with the lambing portion, but something we take for granted for sure. But yeah, do you mind kind of diving into that aspect of it?
So that I can claim zero credit for any of those ideas, right? These are all students. I'm just very fortunate to shepherd a bunch of smart kids that come through here, and I'm just kind of sit back and can watch them develop into scientists. So I've been very fortunate to have and blessed to have a bunch of really, really sharp and motivated students come through here. This latest project with the colostrum stuff was a graduate student who's transitioning from her master's to her PhD and asked, what about, do you think colostrum is contributing to lamb death loss, right? So the more lambs are exposed to colostrum, usually the better survivability they have. You look at the dairy industry, they pay a lot of attention to colostrum and colostrum quality. And I think once you get outside of that species and into other species, it becomes less of a concern because it's more difficult to look at and measure. I mean, nobody's going to be out there milking beef cows out in the field just to take a look at colostrum. So,
and we hope we don't have to look at it.
Correct.
My hope is those lambs hop up and nurse, and I don't have to milk every year.
You don't have to do that. Correct.
Exactly.
So we decided to do that work for you,
right?
Is to go through there. Well, Lee decided to do that work for you. So we set up an experiment last year where we wanted to look at antibody levels in colostrum as a measurement of quality and see if there's any differences based off of the breeding values for fecal egg counts in those Katahdin ewes down at in Glade, Spring, Virginia. So we took 15 low-bred ewes, and we tried to find the sheep that were as extreme as possible. So these ewes are all less than -50 on their fecal egg count breeding value and are between 2 and 6 years of age. The reason that we kind of chose that age range is that that's an age range of ewe that isn't going to take an adjustment based on the age of the dam. So her lambs wouldn't take any, when we do weaning weights adjustments, those lambs wouldn't take any adjustment. So we had kind of those young middle-aged ewes that should be good in colostrum production and milk production, should be at the height of all of that stuff. Then we took 15 ewes that were on the strong positive side of their fecal egg count breeding value. So ewes that are well up over plus 150 on that breeding value. And then Lee milked those ewes at lambing again, mid lactation, and then 60 days after lambing on each one of those ewes. So what we found, and I presented this last year at EAPK and actually got the data from my student while I was driving down there, was remarkable, that there was a 2.5-fold increase in the amount of IgG, or immunoglobulin G. That's the major antibody that's present in sheep and in humans and cattle, etc. That's the most prevalent antibody that we have. Just total IgG, not anything specific to any particular pathogen, but total IgG was 2.5 times greater in ewes with a fecal A count that is more negative than ewes with high positive fecal A counts. So right there out of the gate, we got really excited about that, because colostrum really sets up that lamb to have protection. And so colostrum also doesn't build any immunity. It is a form of passive immunity. It is immunity that is passed on to another animal and usually isn't very long lasting. So when colostrum is absorbed by the lamb, remember that there's kind of this esophageal groove that bypasses or allows that milk to bypass the rumen, because the rumen really isn't functional in day-old lambs, and it won't be till they're about 30 days old. So it bypasses the rumen, goes right to the abomasum, so it can be absorbed and processed and broken down. But the gut lining in most ruminant species is open to absorbing whole proteins for about 6 to 12 hours after birth. So that's why everybody says it's so critical to get colostrum into newborn lambs as fast as you can, because that gut lining will absorb those whole proteins. So that means whole antibody molecules are being absorbed into that lining of particularly the small intestine. And that's going to provide lambs protection. And it's going to be protection against multiple different pathogens. That's why we vaccinate ewes prior to lambing, is to increase the amount of antigen-specific antibody that's coming through the milk, and that those lambs can absorb and have some protection while they themselves are developing their own immune systems. So we did this last year. We found this differences within 30 ewes, 15 low, 15 high. Is that enough? And I think, when was it? It was at the animal science meeting. Cameron forced us to do this on more sheep, and really didn't force us to. It forced us to convince Lee that he needed to milk all of these ewes, and that's about 120, 130 ewes that he had to milk. And we weren't worried about the late lactation. It was just during colostrum. So that 2.5-fold difference was there in colostrum, but it wasn't there in mid and late lactation. Everything kind of the level in the low ewes came down to a comparable level to the hybrid ewes. So we did it this year on a larger swath of that group of sheep. If we split them on fecal A count breeding value of less than -50 as being really, really high, or really, really low, -50 to +50, which is kind of this intermediate zone, and everything greater than +50 for their fecal A count breeding value, we get the same thing that we saw last year. The really high ewes have low antibody production or antibody concentration in their colostrum. The really low ewes, the -50 and lower ewes, have 2.5 times the amount of antibody in their colostrum. We got the same level, the same numbers. All of those things were very consistent between those two groups. And then the ewes in the middle were actually closer to the high ewes than they were the low ewes. So instead of having kind of a step down amount of antibody production, it's really high for the ewes that are less than -50. And then as soon as you go higher than -50, it drops down significantly. Then the low ewes are even just a step lower than that. So the antibody information there that we're getting kind of gives us a glimpse into what maybe what's preparing those lambs or helping them survive better to weaning. We know that's a component of it, is the quality of colostrum that's going to those lambs.
Yeah, and so bringing this back to the industry and application, certainly out in the Southeast or parts of the Midwest where we're grazing sheep out on pasture, and we know it's an issue, and we have reason to select for the fecal egg count EBV in a more negative fashion, or driving those numbers further into that negative category. Do you see value with this generalized immunity and the data that's present now? Do you see value for the fecal egg count EBV to a producer that's in a confinement operation?
So this is I've always, kind of had this goal in my career of understanding the mechanisms of parasite resistance, and I was just going to study that for 30 years and be happy with all of that stuff. The information that we've been discovering over the last couple years has gotten me more excited about the sheep industry than ever. I think that the cattle industry and people working on this in cattle would love to have an EPD that they're already being measured, that is already being measured, that also predicts immunity and generalized immunity. And they don't have it. Swine doesn't have it. Dairy is trying, but you have to infect them with give them an injection of a fungus, and that's only in Canadian dairy herds. So everybody's looking for that magic breeding value that's going to predict immunity. It's going to reduce your use and need for antimicrobials. And for the first time, and I think in the history of forever, sheep might be first at something. And that just gets me excited as somebody who studies sheep and looks at this and has been a kind of involved in the sheep industry my entire life, that it's useful. So I think it's useful for the producer that is in the Southeast grazing lambs, or even in the Ohio River Valley that's grazing lambs, or if you're in Central California grazing lambs on irrigated pastures. I think that these data are useful. If you're raising lambs in a confinement situation where you're going to have a higher incidence of pneumonia or other kind of bacterial infections that are getting into those lambs, if this breeding value is reducing your need for use of antibiotics, that is reducing the cost of production, right? At the end of the day. I think what's really interesting with this is that not only did we see this in Katahdin sheep, we've seen this in polypay sheep. Polypays that are walking around with lower breeding values have higher circulating antibody. And that varies on that split, like I talked about before, less than -50. They are walking around with more antibody than sheep that are in that middle range of -50 to +50. We get above +50, they drop down even lower. So it's a stepwise decrease in antibody production. So I think that we're getting to a point where the fecal egg count breeding value may be more than just being parasite resistant. You might be more disease resistant in general, or just having a better immune response, or more functional immune response. So that's what gets me excited about this. I think the implications are there, and that they seem to be crossbreed. So it doesn't matter what breeds you have. If this breeding value is available to you, you should start seeing the same type of response. Now, Rambouillets, for example, may not have the amount of separation in their fecal egg count breeding value that we see in Katahdins. But even the stuff that's been done by Jake Thorne and Reed Redden at St. Angelo, they're seeing that the lower fecal egg count, that breeding value is still predicting their fecal egg counts. So as long as that's happening, all of our data that we've looked at with Shropshires and with polypays would indicate, as long as the breeding value is predicting fecal egg count, it's also predicting their antibody response.
Well, we're coming up on our time here, and that is absolutely fascinating. Geez, I want to hear more about it. So we'll have to get you on another episode. And
and like we said last time, we appreciate taking the time. The busy beginning here semester, and the information's cool, and we're looking forward to what else comes from it.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate you guys and appreciate what you do.
So, well, we thank you for listening to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. If you want to reach out to us, you got a comment, you can do that by getting a hold of me at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. There's a Facebook page, so make sure you go on there and give that a like and a follow. So it's been good catching up with you guys, and we'll talk to you later.
Sounds good, Tom. Have a good one.
All right. Bye.